Mish Grigor is a Melbourne-based artist who works in performance across a range of collaborative formats. Using autobiographical tools, humour and fiction, she's interested in the unpredictable, often investigating heavy topics with an experimental or humorous approach. Mish is co-director of Aphids and 1/3 of Post, both performative outfits that, as a very broad definition, offer alternative and inclusive perspectives on the everyday. Welcome, Mish. A little round of applause.
Thanks, Debbie. Sorry, it always takes me a second to remember that I'm on Zoom and unmute myself. I may do it again, so if I am mute at any point, just wave. Anyone can wave their arms at me. Hello, everyone. So lovely to talk to you this evening over the internet. I'm on Wurundjeri land, and I would also like to acknowledge that the sovereignty over this land has never been ceded. I live and work here, and I'm very fortunate to do that. Joining you, for anyone who's not familiar, that is the land, the suburb I live in is known as Brunswick, so it's over in Melbourne. And yeah, I guess I'm going to start by sort of introducing myself and my work for anyone who's not familiar, and then hopefully we'll turn it more into a conversation. Yeah, and I want to say thank you, of course, to Guildhouse for having me, and also to Debbie especially. It's been really lovely to think about what are the important conversations that we need to be having, and it just feels like such a great institutional support that everyone in Adelaide has to sort of, you know, be responsive and work quickly, or relatively quickly, in terms of starting those public conversations together. Quite delightful. And, you know, obviously, yeah, as Debbie said, 2020 has been such a huge year, and I'm really interested in the narratives or the way that we articulate that this year to each other while we're still in it. And, you know, as always, art and culture is trying to articulate the moments that we're having, and the moments that we have had, or the moments that we want to have. So I think it's a really exciting and complicated time. Not always good, but, you know, very vibrant. Yeah, and I'm interested in this kind of thing that's been said a lot this year about, you know, we're all in this together, and the kind of rhetoric around the pandemic as though it's a very singular experience. And there was a lot of that, particularly at the beginning. And I think now we're getting more sophisticated with understanding the ways that our stories through the pandemic are very different, and that the kind of year of 2020 has really exposed just how different many people's lives are. And I just thought, as a sort of like same storm, different boat philosophy, which is more realistic, that I would sort of talk about my boat as a way of introducing my practice. So my boat through 2020. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with some images to do that. Okay. So Mish Grigor is my name. So as a bit of background to my boat in 2020, we'll start in 2019. Oh, the computer's not liking that. There we go. So the end of 2019, I presented this work with Aphids that was called Exit Strategies, and it was a solo performance work that was really about leaving and ideas of movement and travel. And it came out of a sort of series of conversations where a lot of people, when I was turning around 30, had said to me, oh, if, you know, as a contemporary artist, if you want to succeed, you really need to leave Australia now. You've sort of done everything that you can do in Australia as an Australian artist. And I really resented those conversations, and it was very interesting for me where they came from. And sometimes it came from senior Australian artists who either had or hadn't made that decision, and were telling me that it was like the most logical and strategic one that I could make for my art career. And I was really interested in like what that means about the kind of ways that we're processing the cultural cringe, and also the ways that we as artists sort of navigate mid-career or late career, or the ways that we find our way through. And I guess I became curious about the relationship to that, or the spectrum, or the conversation between my personal narrative and my personal career, and at the same time a growing personal understanding of the depths of decolonizing processes that we always have to go through as individuals, institutions, a country, or, you know, the kind of failings of that or the failings of my knowledge, a big show. So I had a big kind of idea of like this concept or question I came up with, which was, what happens if all non-Indigenous people left Australia? If we just one day just, there was like a big political announcement, like, okay, if you're not Indigenous, you have to get out and you have 3 days. And what would that look like, and what possibilities or conversations does that possibility open up? And so these kind of were the two big questions of like, should I leave Australia to be an artist, and should we all leave Australia? That became a bit of a spectrum for that show. And I made it with aphids. So I was a performer writer, but aphids, Lara Toms and Eugenia Lim, who are collaborators, sort of made it with me, designed it, and we presented it at Arts House in Melbourne. So that was like the end of last year. Then we had the Christmas bushfire horror time, which I don't think any of us have really been able to process. And I think it was the 3rd or 4th of January, I flew to Hong Kong, where I was rehearsing a Cantonese version of a show that I've been making, that I made in 2014-15 and have performed in a bunch of places around Australia. It's called Oedipus Schmiedipus. I made it with my other collaboration, Post, and someone from Hong Kong saw it and said, would you remake it in Cantonese with with 2 people playing, myself and my co-star Zoe. And the show each night has 25 performers who perform lines from the Western theatrical canon, and we kind of do a joke lecture around them about what we can learn about death from the Western theatrical canon. And it was a really exciting, confusing concept to think about Cantonese language, Cantonese culture. But of course, Hong Kong was colonized by the Brits in the same way that we were. And so they have this shared kind of, experience of learning Shakespeare in high school. and this idea of, or I guess, series of conversations in the artistic and larger communities around how those things influence what is high culture, what is valuable, what is considered meaningful output. So I went quickly in the new year to rehearse the show. It had already happened in Hong Kong, but it was touring to Australia. So I was rehearsing it in Cantonese with this enormous, I guess what you would call like a main stage company, but it means a very different thing in Hong Kong than it does in Australia. So there are like 25 full-time actors. There was like a stage crew of, I think we had 12 people. It was very bilingual room. We had various translators at various positions. It was like a very complex, big, massive program. And we were rehearsing it a little bit early, so it was going to come out in March. Then I came home to work with 2 artists, Emma Hall and Vijay Rajan, and they were working on a show called Hurricane, which was a kind of contemporary performance piece about a massive world-changing event that the environment produced and set a whole bunch of people into crisis. I was a performer in that. It was just a development at Arts House. And the whole time, also like just as a thing about my boat, like when I was in Hong Kong, the protests were on, so big mass protests. And the virus had just sort of been announced by China. And so I remember getting off the plane, and my friends who, were taking care of us were like, oh, just so you know, there's like another flu. Apparently it's really bad. So if you want to wear masks, like you should get some. And we were like, oh, like didn't really think anything of it. And that was like on the 3rd of January. So it just feels very early that I've had this conversation going. But then we were curious to go and see the Hong Kong protests. So we did get masks because our friends who were like, some had various levels of involvement in the protests were like, yeah, you'll get tear gas. It's no big deal. They just kept saying like, you'll get bad poo-poo for a few days because it plays with your stomach. And so, we were in Hong Kong, and wearing a mask was quite a strange, unfamiliar experience. So we took a bunch of photos of ourselves just in the street wearing masks before the protest, because we were like, wow, I don't know, it just felt like a novelty to be wearing a mask. It was very strange to think about how, quickly that imagery of the mask on the face has changed, and what it has meant and will mean for this year and in an ongoing sense. Then I came home after Melbourne, then I came to Adelaide to present How with aphids again. So that's with my other collaboration. And we were working at the Art Gallery of South Australia. Some of you might have seen it. And it's this huge, big outdoor spectacle of a work that is kind of a commemoration of banned artworks, but represented and reimagined in really silly and ridiculous ways. And in that, we had a bunch of performers all sharing different types of, we had like one scene that was at the end, which was inspired by Terra Nullius by Soda Jerk. And there's a lot of sort of face masks in that, and everyone was sharing face masks and just swapping them around backstage, which now gives me like stress just thinking about it. And it was sort of like the last live event in my life. Last time that my practice was really like active in the way that I had previously worked. I flew home after the show opened in Adelaide to bump in Oedipus Schmiedipus. So it was going to be performed in Asia Topa Festival, which is like a festival that looks at the relationship, I suppose, as like Australia is part of an Asian utopia is supposed to be the concept. And we were presenting the English language version and the Cantonese Hong Kong version in pairing. So for the first time, they'd be like, you'd be able to see both and to compare both casts and crews. And we were getting Cantonese speaking volunteers from the Melbourne diasporic community. So it was like really a lot of community development, and there were like 22 people about to get on a plane. We were like doing the lighting plot, and then the state got shut down. And, you know, even to talk about my journey through 2020 and my practice's journey is obviously really different to most of the community around Guildhouse, because Melbourne's lockdown was so much different and to anywhere else in Australia. And you know, I was talking to Debbie the other day in preparation for this, and it's very strange to try and articulate, just even now that we've sort of begun to go back into normal world, it still really feels like everyone in Melbourne has gone through this very strange thing together where it got really, really dark. And I don't think I've ever experienced something so communally shit. Like it really did feel like even, you know, if you were lucky enough to be in a safe, warm house with a food, like with a hot dinner every night, so you were really privileged, you were able to work from home, there was still this kind of intense weight over everyone you interacted with. And, you know, not being able to go outside for more than an hour a day just makes you a little bit loopy, I think. So I think there's like a lot of strangeness. Yeah, and so I think I've had a lot of time to think about, and this is the other project that I was making this year was, I did a show last year called The Temple, where I was an actor in a contemporary performance work at the Malt House with an Irish company. And after the Cantonese speaking, after the Asia Topa season, I was meant to fly to Ireland to continue working on a new show, which should have premiered, I think, actually like last week, but obviously couldn't happen. Yeah, so these are just like, I guess, to talk through the different contexts and arrangements that I tend to work in, or the way that I've kind of eked out different ways of working with different groups of people. And yeah, I was thinking about how to talk about like these ideas of resilience and adaptability. I remember that once when I was quite young, someone said to me, what's the difference between Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison? And it's quite a hard comparison to make now, because I'm like the youngest person who knows who Roy Orbison is. So I think for younger people, you have to think of like Beyonce and Katy Perry. But this guy who I was talking to, I remember he said, like, you know, Roy Orbison was always Roy Orbison. Like he, from the start of his career as a pop singer to the end, like he always just looked, felt and sang like Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison is the Beyonce. Like Beyonce is just, has always been Beyonce. When you look back now, you're like, oh my God, what were the other two even there for? It was always Beyonce. And she's like always going bigger, bolder, beautiful, incredible, bizarro, right? And there's Katy Perry, that's Elvis, right? Like obviously talented, but has kind of gone through this thing of like, I can be whatever you want me to be. You know, I can be this type of music, I can do that, I can follow this trend, I can sort of perform for the market in any way. And ultimately working without integrity in that way, and this is like looking to Katy Perry's future, to what happened to Elvis, is like you just get chewed up and spat out by the market because you cannot conform to it at all times. And I think that for artists, you know, we always have to have this sense of what we will do, what will be part of our practice, what we won't do. I think, you know, if I do some acting, I think in an acting sense, you could easily kind of imagine scenarios like, would I do a McDonald's ad? You know, that's a very simple question. Like, it's heaps of money, but they're evil. What does that bring up ethically? Is that part of my practice, or does it cross out? You know, what are the ways that do work and don't work? So for me, I would say one of the interesting things is like, I work in live performance. My work is live, it's not digital, would be a rule that I always would have. Then though, in the pandemic, it suddenly became really clear, like I was very resistant to the kind of rush to presenting work digitally. Like I was like, oh no, like that's insane. Like works that are conceived to be live can't just be switched to be digital, or it's a whole different set of tools. It's a whole different way of working, yada, yada. And I really resisted. And then because my lockdown was so long and like dark, I was like just going mad with not being creative. And suddenly it sort of brought something up for me, which was like, I want to make something, I want to do something. And a lot of it, you know, especially with like doing Oedipus for Asia Topa, to the point of bumping in the show, like installing and then having to pack down and walk away, I realized like a lot of what I kind of mourned about not being able to do that show was the feeling of sharing with my peers and community the thing that I have made. And like, of course we know this intellectually, but like it was just torn so rawly from me that like, oh, so much of how I make meaning of my work is in the sharing of conversation or feedback in various forms. And so I think that for me, this during the pandemic, this idea of like working digitally or working online has sort of shifted, because it has been about maintaining artistic community or encountering artistic community in different ways. Like at first I was quite happy to watch a bunch of sort of archival performances, because for me I was like, oh, I feel like I'm a student again. I'm a student of my form. I'm like watching these overseas companies that I probably would never get to see, and I can access their work. But after a while of lockdown, I was like, no, it's really important for me to see the people I know and whose careers I've been following, you know, even if we're not friends, but I've been encountering them for 10 years or 15 years, because I'm in conversation with them. My work is even if it's really different, it's in conversation. So I guess I started to think about this rule that I always have about like Elvis versus Roy Orbison, about like what makes up what you do and what you don't do. And certainly context is one thing. You know, like I talk about my work being context responsive when I'm making a show, or like when we did Hal at the Art Gallery of South Australia, it was responsive to the space. It was responsive to the kind of, you know, architectures and presentations that happen in the art gallery in South Australia. But yeah, I just became really aware that there's this kind of little patchwork that we make up our understanding of our practice, that sits between like context and community and wider culture, and the kind of support that we get, or the kind of training that we've had, the opportunities that might lead to other opportunities, you know, like you just get on a track sometimes. What I'm calling like herd mentality, which is like different to herd immunity, but like the kind of the things that your friends are doing that you either want to go in with the herd or reject and do something really different. And I guess that's related to like fashion, like what's fashionable. And then of course, what's politically happening for you and the world, and then what's possible for you in the world. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are other like factors, but I just think that that's a really big time for all of us to be thinking about how and why we do what we do as artists, and what's in the practice and what's informing the practice. Yeah. I could go on, but maybe it's a good time to pause.
Sure.
And check in.
This is so wonderfully rich in content, Mish, and I'm so pleased that we're having deep chats with you, because I feel like there are so many, not tangents, but topics within topics when it comes to what this year has been. And I also love that analogy of the boat, because we are in such different boats, and I do completely acknowledge that, you know, we last saw aphids in March, and there was an incredible performance that the entire city really rallied around and really beautifully enjoyed, and kind of celebrated to have that in this city at that time, not kind of knowing what would happen just a few days later, really. But our lockdown was obviously so incredibly different to the Melbourne experience. And yeah, our boats have been rocked in very different ways. So I really thank you for being open and generous about your experience, because I realise everyone's still synthesising that time. There's still so many layers of what has happened during that time. This probably seems a bit, I don't know, feel a bit silly asking something so obvious, because that was the last time that we saw you. But how do you feel that your community has coped? Because obviously there's been so many different responses, and online is just one response. But I imagine there's some retreating, there's some online counselling, there's so many different ways to think it through, not just personally, but through practice. What do you think has been a really common observation?
Well, I think that, I suppose I'm in a sort of strange position, because I work, as I have described, you know, across a bunch of different contexts. But I suppose aphids is an organisation. So we have a sort of organisational structure, we have a board, and we are in contact with other organisations on like a sector check-in level. And then of course there's like my friendship community, and then there's the larger, I suppose, arts community. I honestly, because I feel like on an institutional level, if I think about what's happening in Melbourne, like quite frankly, what's happening is that institutions are fighting to keep exist, to stay alive and not just close down. And there's been, you know, a bunch of help with that, but in terms of like what that means, it's quite difficult, I think, because once they start surviving, it means that the help, either through presenting artists, or the kind of programming they do, or the conversations that they're having with artists about work that might happen in 2 years, is falling short, because they're just doing whatever they can do to like save their own asses right now, with the idea that they can then go on and for the next 20 years work with artists, you know. But I think that combined with the fact that like artists weren't even allowed to go to their studios, combined with the fact that artists couldn't hang out and have a coffee or like have a wine, means that like it's just really shut down still. And like I've been working this week in a room with the aphids again, which has been super exciting, but also exhausting. I don't know if anyone else, I feel like if you are all feeling this, but like how did we all be so social all the time? I have no idea. And yeah, I just think that there's been such and I'm sure that, you know, if I try and connect what I imagine is happening in Adelaide, I'm sure it's had that same, you know, like line in the sand in a way, where everything has stopped, or has stopped the way that it was, certainly.
Completely. And I feel like there's some really different experiences again, in terms of completely not being able to go to your studio and continue on working, versus having more work, or your work amping up. So it's kind of two really polar opposite experiences, where it's but I think both are actually equally exhausting, because the mental energy that they take on is kind of equal, really.
Yeah, and I think that one of the big things about practice is that you know, momentum is a really big part of your arts practice. So that might be like career momentum, like you got this show and then you got this show, or you met this curator. But it might be also like just the, you know, it's a very sort of obvious thing to say, but of course, like if you're in a process and you're building and slowly working on something, and then it gets stopped, not because you like, you know, hit a dead end, but because you were forced to stop. It's like, I think that there's a part of me that thinks, well, how can art, you know, as a provocation, like how can art that wasn't made from the pandemic be speaking to this moment right now? Like maybe we should all thank the world that we couldn't go to our studios, because we do need to consider something new. Like the world is so different in 2020. So how do we force ourselves around that corner in our thinking, in our making, in every area? But also I think that if you're in any way younger, that can be really, really like challenging. If you were just establishing what you do, if you were, I guess, precarious in any way, if you're a mum who just started practicing again, you know, like all those things, that's those so delicate, and it's like, who sticks around through those challenges? It tends to be people who are comfortable, privileged, supported, yada yada.
Definitely.
The same old boring stories.
And what kind of same old boring story will they provide at the end of this pandemic? Will they be talking in a silo to themselves, or will they have will their shift kind of tilt a little bit?
Yeah, I think we know the answer.
Yeah, I think you're right there. APHIS has managed to continue offering some really incredible opportunities to the community, particularly with the No Contest Art Prize. I'm wondering if you can tell me how on earth you all managed to devise that and deliver that at such an odd and urgent time.
Well, I guess because we are an organizer, it was like we had a gift given to us in a lot of ways. Like we were like, the state government gave us a chunk of money as like, they gave every organization in Australia, in Victoria, a chunk of money to like, there was meant to be like survival money, here's $10,000. And we were really like, wow, we're already in such a lucky position, because we were able to access JobKeeper when a lot of our artist friends weren't able to, and have been and continue to really, really like struggle, you know, people who work in hospitality as their side job a few days a week or whatever it is, you know, a million stories. And so it really felt like a strange thing to suddenly be flush at a time when everyone is struggling. And also we just had been in so many conversations around how exhausting 2020 has been in terms of access, like the kind of funds that artists could access in terms of, you know, the Australia Council put out, you know, that I can't remember what they're called, like Restore, Revive or something.
Adapt.
Grants.
Yeah,
Adapt.
Adapt. Yes.
And that, once again, like this idea of delicate practice. If you were struggling and then you put in an application talking about how you were struggling, and then you were rejected because you weren't struggling enough, or what, you couldn't articulate the way, you know, like I think that's a really tricky feeling. And a lot of really established artists that I was talking to were saying that they could have had a very different lockdown if they had like a universal basic income or something, you know, that they were lucky and accessing money, but they were spending all of their time doing grants and sort of like re-traumatizing by telling the difficult stories about how hard their life and practice was, in a way that was like proving it or convincing an institution of its worthiness or something. I just think it's like, it's a really complicated, and of course, like, I don't know what the alternative is. Like, do we just get millionaires to give artists money? No questions asked. Like, of course we all want that, but the system that we have is so imperfect, and I feel like especially practices that are in any way marginalized, I think that we've come through a particular narrative in Australian practice where there has been money, and the money's been distributed to institutions in order for it to trickle down to artists. But in the last few years, the money's gotten less and less, and the institutions are fighting to maintain the scale of work and the scale of organisation that they are. and artists are trying to be in relationship with those institutions, and the money pool at the kind of end of the trickle down process has gotten less and less. And artists are spending more and more time trying to find ways to survive. And anyway, so this was just like a tiny thing that we could just take the money that we got and give it straight away to artists at random. Also because it's kind of a joke, like I've been in so many of those rooms of judging or giving away grants or programming, and you know, there's always more people that you want to give the money to than you possibly could, and there is an element of chance in that room of who happens to be there or whose application. You know, you get 3 applications that are about a work that is about rivers, and you're like, well, we're going to choose, we're not going to like fund 3 river works, we're going to do the one river work, one, you know, like it's like there's a strangeness to that. Like, it's not an exact science. So yeah, we just wanted to like give some money at a completely like in a completely honestly random way, and also to acknowledge that that it, like, to make it really easy, like just put your name down, and that's
the lottery.
What artists should do.
I love it, because that's, I must admit, at Guildhouse, that's something we've had such a huge response to, is the exhaustion of applying for grants at this time. And, you know, I was having a conversation with one of our established artists just the other day who said that she had applied for 8 grants and she was really lucky to receive 2, but they were all really, really big grants, that it was just so exhausting to put that effort in, knowing that she's still delivering the exhibition that she'd promised. It's just trying to figure out how on earth she does that differently now. Emma, I noticed that you would like to ask a question. Do you want to pop your mic on and ask?
Oh, thank you. Hey, Mish, how you going?
Hello, good. How are you?
Good. It's so good to hear your voice and have you chat with us. I really appreciated so many things about what you said, and the analogy about being in a different boat in the same storm really, I think, is actually a very helpful way of us understanding and talking about our shared and yet very different experiences. And I did want to just share with you that you sort of talked about this sort of this strangeness of coming out of lockdown in Melbourne, and this sort of people sort of wandering around slightly dazed, trying to navigate the things we did without even thinking about it. And yes, our experience in Adelaide has been vastly different, but I can absolutely relate. And I think in terms of people's energy and the energy exchange that comes from being around other human beings and being in large populated areas or noisy spaces, it's just, there's so many things that have been disrupted. And, you know, you spoke about that really beautifully. And one of the things I really wanted to ask you, and you were talking about the patchwork of things that you've observed and the experiences, I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts on what you have felt, and perhaps if you feel comfortable speaking on behalf of some of the other people that you work with in your various collectives, about the impact of how the government has spoken or not spoken about artists and their work in the whole response to this pandemic. Widely reported, most widely, you know, most affected sector, and yet it's been relatively invisible. I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts, and it would be interesting to hear other people's in the conversation tonight about that response, because I think that is a really profound issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge, right? It's so huge. I think one of the things that I've been, I guess, prompted to think about this year is that perhaps one of the reasons that a lot of people found the pandemic so traumatizing, or the lockdown so traumatizing, is like, is it, question mark, indicative of how safe we feel? Like, I was just, I suppose, in this idea of, you know, same boat, same storm, different boats. Like, I think some people are really used to upheaval, you know, environmental upheaval, social upheaval. And I think that we have a relatively overworked but safe life in the arts. And, you know, like, I think that that I think of the kind of classic, like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs about, like, you know, like getting food and water and air is obviously enormously important. You know, being safe from violence is important. And then this idea of, like, or I suppose, like, how do we talk about the importance of art making for ourselves, for each other, for our community? Like, it is that idea of like cultural fulfillment, making meaning of life. Like, most of us, obviously in this Zoom room, but in our community, have dedicated our lives to this thing. And so I think when it was ripped away, it's just like, it ripped away like in a kind of panicky moment as well, I think, where it was like, what is this pandemic? How bad is this going to get? How long is this going to get? It wasn't like I think if now looking at myself in March, if someone had said, in a year's time, it's going to be a bit calmer, then you would kind of have that in your head and you're like, great, I'll learn French. But I think that there was this thing of like, everyone you know is losing all their work, and all the big people who are supposed to be really solid, like the Melbourne Theatre Company, I don't know, you know, suddenly they're talking about like, we might not make it through the year. And you're like, holy shit. Like, you know, I think that in those times, I can only think of like the millions of terrible war movies I've seen, but I think certainly that's when we turn to leadership, you know, like, and I think that even within the arts, like, we looked at certain people who could speak, who could maybe guide us. We looked at our artistic elders and people who've been through, like, you know, been through ups and downs and could perhaps give us like a bit of big picture speak. You know, like even on, I think it's on SBS or something, like Uncle Jack Charles has, well, there's like some little bite size, I mean, it must be ABC, there's little bite-sized stories about the pandemic, and he says, you know, like, anyone who lived through the AIDS crises of the 80s didn't feel so unfamiliar with the pandemic, or the kind of ways that we were getting information about the pandemic, you know, and these long stories, these long lives, and then how that can give us leadership. And I think that, you know, there's like two things for me. There's the thing of like, what's happening to universities, what's happening to funding, like as an artist who's practicing now as like a grown up, but who very much came from a working class upbringing. I think of the artists who are coming from the worlds that I was in, and what pathways they might have through to being in the arts in any way, in culture in any way, or in fact, like doing an arts degree, which is like, let's be honest, most people who did an arts degree ended up not working in the arts, but, you know, can have a great dinner party. So I think that, you know, there's a war on ideas, there's a war on critical thinking, and there's a war on culture in so many ways that happens from our politicians. And that's sort of feels like it's been happening for a long time. Certainly my whole career, it feels like that when I came into the arts as at uni, I remember all my teachers saying like, oh, you'll never be able to pay your rent. Like, it was so easy to live on the dole when we were, you know, in the 90s, and just like making, you know, like there's always this story of it getting worse and worse for artists in this country. Has been happening for a while, but it feels like the Morrison government has just accelerated. That's a truth. And I'm like, I'm resigned to that in some ways, but the kind of like, on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like, I'm used to him taking away my safe food and shelter. Like, I'm not living in Scandinavia. Like, I know I'm going to have to fight to get those things as an artist, as a vocation. But the kind of like spiritual, cultural messaging that our government has given, and the like complete like lack of language, and I don't know, like, I think there's something in like deep in my soul that feels battered by that, in a way that I think in the arts in Australia we spend a lot of time, like, even amongst ourselves, like justifying our existence, apologizing for our existence, not apologizing for sometimes things like being too weird or too complicated. Like, I try to make work that is very accessible, but I think also sometimes we just waste a lot of time contextualizing things, so that because we feel apologetic for something. And I think that's, we all kind of, I don't know, imagine what it must be like in Germany or whatever, you know, but there's no utopia, because I think, you know, once you spend time in those places, you see that rhetoric and funding. You know, it's not perfect.
No.
And this place is really special, but yeah, I do think there's something, there's like a deep wound that could have gone the other way.
Exactly. There was a real wonderful opportunity but I think that, as you say, this is an ongoing trajectory that we've been on for some time. But the other point that I was very curious to explore with you was your role in collaborations and artist-led organizations. I think is very exciting. And I think there is, you know, over history, we can point to many occasions where things looked pretty dire and pretty shite. And artist-led action was actually vital to reimagining what futures look like. And in fact, not just for the artistic community at all, but for community at large. So, you know, are you, within your artist-led communities, is that conversations that you're having? Or is it something that you have all the time and it's continuing on?
Well, I certainly, when I know that Emma and I were both at the Arts Day on the Hill last year, and again this year, which is NABA's program, or I guess big day of advocacy and representation for the arts on a federal parliamentary level, to parliamentarians. And I had a meeting with Tony Burke this year, and I was talking to him about the New Deal, that, you know, the New Deal in the US, and the kind of way that major projects and artists were a way to spend our way out of the recession. And I was like, you've really got to get in there, Tony, and just like talk about the New Deal, because we know it works. Like, it worked for the US, and it created a lot of the kind of mid-century art movements, which we're still excited by and influenced by. But yeah, I think that another one of aphids' programs that we run is called we do these like aphids drop-in centers, and they're, I guess we're always interested in holding context or holding space for intergenerational and cross art form discussion, sometimes for really long, you know, for a year-long discussion, and sometimes for really discrete periods. So I have this idea of a drop-in center, and you can just book, they're just like, we just advertise them, and then it's like, we'll just do a day, and we do, like, this year it was like Zooms, and there were half an hour each with one of us, and we would just like workshop an idea with you. It could be like a creative problem, could be a you know, producing thing, it could be what should my portfolio look like, how do I contact this, you know, anything big or small.
Amazing.
But it was very interesting to me that just like how isolated people, and this was national, it wasn't just Melbourne or Victoria, how that isolation of arts practice was really affecting, like during the pandemic year, was really affecting people on a personal, like on a mental health level. And I think that, you know, obviously I'm not the first person to notice that, but I think that it's certainly given me pause to think about how we nurture or build artistic community. And, you know, I think that's this sort of strange alchemy between institutions and presentation context, and just like, obviously going out and hanging out is the most simple but most profound thing that artists have done for a long time, for, you know, hundreds of years. But yeah, I think to think about, I think it's like for us to think about how we exist in that community outside of just seeing friends and supporting them, but to also think about how we can grow or service community. And it's really tricky, I think, because artists are often, or especially at the moment, feeling overwhelmed or feeling at the edge of burnout. But I suppose it's like, how can that be, I don't know, this is a bad word, but nourishing. Yeah, so how can, like, the resources that you do have be used reciprocally with each other? And, you know, like, I certainly started out that way with just like no money, but lots of time as a young artist. And we would just hold shows for each other, and like, in a very like similar mode to most artist run initiatives, which is just like, we all muck in, make it happen, see each other's work. And I think that the first thing I think is that we should always remember that, what that means and what that feels like. And second of all, I think that as we progress through our careers, we should always remember how we're mucking in for each other and what we're getting out of that from each other.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mish, I have a question in our little chat bar from Henry Wolf,
Hello,
asking, how do you stay true to the values within your practice so that you can be the Beyonce in the situation?
It's like, I feel like giving a talk where I'm like, how can you be the Beyonce? It's like, I'm like, basically I'm making mugs now. Like I'm making coffee mugs. It's like, first of all, you get 150 assistants. Yeah, I mean, well, I think that's a thing of, or I guess why I bring it up tonight at the end of my talk of 2020 is that I think we're always assessing and reassessing these things, you know, like, I think that some of the big questions of our arts career or survival, and some of the big questions of our arts practice and our arts, you know, what we're doing, that we're going to keep asking the same questions. If we're lucky, we're going to keep asking them for our whole life, you know, and that's really what a line of inquiry is that you just keep going. But I think for me, I guess that's the thing of like, as a performer, knowing what you do and what you don't do. So I think that thing of self-knowledge, and that doesn't mean that like, oh, I just do like, you know, I think we've all been through phases where you're like, I just want to work with plaid, you know, like all my work's going to be like plaid patterns, you know, like you can change, of course, and evolve, but I think it's about criticality and about thinking about, well, where does it feel like I'm doing my work, and where does it feel like I'm just responding? Like, it's funny, I just reminded myself of I went to an Eileen Miles talk in Sydney Writers Festival, might have been 2 years ago now, and they spoke about, you know, like when you start, you have these ideas and you just write them down, and it sort of just comes out, and then someone says, can you do a newsletter? Yeah, I can do a newsletter. Can you do an introduction to my academic book? Yeah, I can do that. And then he's like working in all these different contexts, and the way that they articulate it is that then it gets harder and harder to step back and go, hang on, do I do newsletters? Like, do I really want to write in an academic context? Like, because you're just responding to the opportunity without thinking about if it's really creatively satisfying for you. So I think it's just like having that criticality as you're trying to navigate. That's why I talk about one of the things of my patchwork is like possibilities or opportunities, because I think that they're both really important. Like, opportunities are amazing. You might get an opportunity to do something, but like it might just be like, oh yeah, can you do a performance? We've only got $100, but it's at a really big museum, and we need you to make, it's on Friday, so like you've got like 2 days because someone dropped out, and you'd be like, oh my god, I could just stand and be like a statue person, but like I'm not going to feel good about that. It's not really what I do. I don't have anything ready. Sometimes you have to say no, you know, but then it's like possibilities. It's like I could sit and like, I don't know, it's hard to talk in abstract or to try to think of, make up my own examples. I really just think it's about that the most important thing you own is your studio practice, you know, like, because then if you're going in, even if you don't have a studio, if you just have an hour of the day or mornings over your coffee where you're daydreaming and writing your book, like that you're thinking outside of the context of capitalism and institutions. You're just doing the thing that you do and following what you're interested in, or daydreaming, imagining, whatever it is. But there has to be some area that's just you, and everything else comes out of that, as opposed to just being the Katy Perry and trying to, you know, swim towards where everything already is.
And I feel like it's really hard as well if you've been offered an opportunity with someone that you respect or an institution that you admire, and it's not quite the opportunity that you want, it's not quite on track with who you are, but you don't want to say no to it because you're thinking about the possibilities and what it could lead to. And you think, well, this could just be the stepping stone, and now I'm in their realm and they'll think of me for that other thing. So it's kind of like, oh, am I going to get a bad rep if I say no to that? So Yeah, it is. I feel like that's a really common thing for artists to kind of come up against in terms of knowing exactly who they are, and also being confident in verbalizing to whoever's inviting them to say, this isn't quite what I do, but, you know, can we think about something on this track?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is most of the time it's not black and white. Like most of the time it's not, hey, Mish Grigor, can you come and sing the main role in the Harry Potter musical? Like, because no one's going to ask me that. I don't have the talent, interest, community. Like I'm not in that world, you know, and it would be a very easy no. But it's the hard ones are when you're like, oh, it's a bit what I do, or like it's almost there, or the conditions are almost right. But I don't think, like, I know it takes me 8 months to do one painting, like I know that, you know, or I know that I need this much rehearsal, or I know that the week before I'm doing this other thing and I actually need that space and I won't be able to dedicate, you know, like it's, I think you learn through getting it wrong. Actually, a lot of the time is like you learn like, oh man, I really, you know, I knew I had it in my gut going in that would be too hectic, or that would be wrong, or that, yeah, I think you just learn through practice, unfortunately.
Yeah, I do too. I want to ask you another question about political leadership. And I'm thinking about, you know, you mentioned earlier that aphids were able to make an offering based on the funding that they were receiving. And being especially that aphids is such a politically confronting and urgent group of people, do you ever feel like you might tip that edge and suddenly you're not receiving funding, much like, I mean, I guess Soda Jerks still received their funding, but there was quite a, you know, a lot of promotion around that, which probably worked in their favour, to be honest. But really, is that something that that you worry about as an organisation?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we like, that's the weird thing, I think, for us, as it's our first ever institutional position. And I think that when you're inside of an institution, you're not just responsible for yourself, you're responsible for this other entity. And, you know, I guess on an organizational level, we're really lucky that we have a board who really understand our like values and really supportive of us being a bit like bolshy and cheeky in the world. But yeah, I think that this idea of risk and what we, you know, like the Casey Jenkins example was really interesting. I don't know if people are familiar with Casey's work and the kind of recent things that have happened this year with her practice, because it was at Vitals. Do people know that? I don't know what the room.
Yeah, I see some nods and I see some. Do you want to unpack it a little bit?
Well, yeah, just that. So she's an artist, performance artist, makes very in-your-face work, and is doing an ongoing project about, I guess, insemination. I think it's called Immaculate Conception or some play on that. Yeah. Where she's like live streaming her, like, you know, putting a sperm donor's sperm into her vagina, and I don't, you know, and that she got a lot of, one of those strange moments. I think that, you know, often it's just like this sort of storm in a teacup. Like all of a sudden the conservative world was like looking at her and, you know, she got a bunch of really violent feedback. But then some institutions got really freaked out, and one of those included Australia Council, and she had received money. There was money for a stream, as I understand it,
the live stream, I think.
Yeah, but she had like the money. She received one of those grants, which was about career development. So it was like a big chunk of money for a whole, like a year-long thing of like doing a whole bunch of stuff, and they took the money back, or they hadn't paid her yet, or something like that. I'm going to get the details wrong because it was way back, like 6 weeks ago. My brain's a sieve.
10 years, yeah.
But yeah, I guess we, in speaking publicly against that, we were aware that we received money from the Australia Council, and so like in a way they are an investor, or they have a, we have to have a good relationship with them, and it's not just like me as an artist speaking. It's like I'm representative of this company that's been going for I think 27 years now, and that's a weight on my shoulders. Yeah, and I think that we all, I mean, I'm really lucky at aphids because we have the three of us as co-directors together to talk that through. But I think ultimately it's like, I don't know, I just think it's like, how do you sleep at night or something, like you have to, I remember one time at the Australian Theatre Forum in about 2010 or something, maybe earlier, it must have been 2006 or 8, I don't know. I feel like I tell this story all the time where there was a women in theatre working group, and it was like down in the basement, and there were like 30 women and one man, he was a gay man, of course. And they were putting, it was when the Australia Council was putting together their, they have like a platform paper, it's not called that, but it was about women in main stage contexts in theatre. And a lot of women were sharing stories about, their experiences. And I was like one of the youngest people there. And I was quite, young and bolshy and vocal and like, this is fact. Like, and this older woman who I didn't know at the thing, like at previous, turned to me at the end and she was like, just be careful, just be careful, because people don't like outspoken artists. Like, she said to me, I remember, like, I'm paraphrasing, but very clearly the image, don't sacrifice your career on the altar of feminism. And it was like a senior artist speaking to a young artist about, like, I don't know, shutting up, like, wow. And it really struck me. It was really just like, okay, what kind of world do we want to live in? Like, I think for me, I want to live in a world, not that I'm in any way like superior or perfect, like aphids fucks up all the time, but we want to live in a world where we can have rigorous debate with each other, not just about the work, but about how we make the work, about the art world that we make, and about trying to think about how power works and how, we're all living in late capitalism. We've all been socialized in the West. That means we're all fucked. Like, we're all taking that's how we've made reality. So of course the art world's going to reflect that reality, and we have to sort of break it and pull it and bend it together by talking to each other about the mistakes that we make.
What was your reaction to that comment to you?
At the time, I was like, I don't know, I was like 22 or something. I was just like, okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
I didn't have like, now I'd be like, let's talk about what that means.
What's happened to you where you have that point of view? Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mish. This has been a really wonderful conversation going in many directions, but I think all very, very necessary directions. So thank you kindly. We've just gone a little past 8. So does anyone have any final questions or comments? Questions, really. We don't want comments. Any? No. Thank you so much, Mish. A little round of applause. Really
wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you for having me.